which is not your language. I'm going to try very hard to speak slowly and clearly, even with the help of our translator. But if anyone in the back cannot hear me, or if I'm not speaking clearly enough, raise your hand. Okay? Not yet. I haven't said anything yet. This is a very important moment for me. Not only because it's my first trip to your wonderful country and your beautiful city, but because of a miraculous coincidence that I didn't know about until today. In this volume, Movimentos Sociais, Participação e Reconhecimento, I read the following. Don't worry, I will not read it in Portuguese. In 1983, was born at the UFSC the nucleus of research in social movements, fruit of a joint work of professors and students at the postgraduate level in social sciences. In 1983, I published my first book on social movements. So for me, this is a miraculous coincidence, and I want to thank my hosts and my hostesses doubly for the opportunity to come and speak with you. Thank you very much. Contentious events often come in waves, but they're seldom homogeneous. Consider this sequence of events in Europe in the month of May. In Athens, 3 people were killed when protesters set fire to a bank during a general strike over austerity. In Madrid and in Paris, the major union confederations called a strike of public sector workers over their government's austerity programs. In Germany, Chancellor Merkel was heckled in the Bundestag for her support of the Greek bailout plan. Every one of these events was the result of the global financial crisis that began in the United States in 2008 and diffused around the world. In the United States itself, there was a populist reaction to the crisis, the so-called Tea Party movement, which challenged members of Congress at town meetings, dressed up as revolutionary soldiers, and supported conservative candidates in the elections of 2009 and 2010. Even in little Iceland, halfway between Europe and America, outbursts of protest forced the Prime Minister and his cabinets to resign. But it was in the European Union that the crisis hit hardest. As pressure mounted on the Greek government, European Union leaders became alarmed. For if Greece defaulted, not only would it affect the French and German bankers who owned most of its debt, but the entire monetary structure of the Eurozone could crumble. In response, France and Germany, together with the IMF, began to consider offering financial guarantees to stop the rot that was threatening to bring down the euro. At this point, the unity of the EU began to crumble as violent protests targeted Athens, and strikes broke out in France and Spain, opposition to the bailout forced Chancellor Merkel to delay offering German support. In the event, her political party lost the regional election, and she emerged from the crisis a little loser. Now, why should I begin a talk at a conference on social movements here in Brazil with the 2008 financial crisis and its diffusion from the United States to Europe? I think the crisis and the resistance to it has 4 lessons to teach us about social movement research. The first lesson has to do with the nature of the capitalist crisis that triggered these events. The spread of that crisis from America to Europe involved at least 3 international institutions: the EU, the European Central Bank, and the IMF. Globalization and internationalization have produced a far more integrated response to the crisis than our predecessors had available in 1929 to cope with the Great Depression. But the second lesson of the story is the limits to globalization and internationalization. True, the crisis sped rapidly from the United States to the European Union because of the institutional links between the 2 hegemons. But the varied responses to it in Greece, France, Spain, Germany, the United States were so great that they tell us that there are still important national differences. The third lesson is that while the financial crisis sparked a great deal of contentious politics, it took different forms in each country. In fact, as Breno and Eckhart Munoz recently wrote, what some have called the international anti-globalization movement could not articulate a convincing response faced by a system that has been marked by multidimensional crises like those that were denounced by anti-globalization protests since its beginnings. The fourth observation is one you may find controversial. And it is that social movements are only one of a number of forms of contentious politics. And if we limited our attention to movements, we would miss a number of important phenomena that parallel, that combine with, and that sometimes arise in opposition to. This is the standpoint that I call the contentious politics program. And it grew out of the tradition of research that I come from called the political process model. In that model, which will be familiar to many of you, political opportunities, mobilizing structures, and the cultural framing of collective action come together in the study of social movement campaigns. This was a useful model, and it served us well, both in Europe and in the United States. But it was a static model. It told us nothing about the dynamics of contention. A decade ago, the late Charles Tilly and Doug McAdam and myself tried to build a more dynamic model, one which would focus not on the structures that lie behind contentious politics, but on the mechanisms and processes that connect these structures to a broader range of contentious politics. In our book, Dynamics of Contention, which appeared in Spanish as La Dinámica de la Contienda, but is not available in Portuguese, in INT, we tried to demonstrate how different forms of political conflict are driven by similar mechanisms and processes.